So hello, my name is Whitney DeVos, and I'm a doctoral student in literature at UC Santa Cruz, and today I'll be interviewing Kelly Brown, who's the Research Programs Manager at UCHRI in Irvine, California. So hi, Kelly.
Hi.
So I'd like to begin by having you tell us a little bit about your life prior to the PhD. How did you decide to pursue one? And did you go to graduate school because you initially wanted to become a professor?
Okay. Before pursuing doctoral studies at Santa Cruz, I actually worked in government for 5 years. And so when I graduated from undergrad with a degree in English, I had thought I wanted to go into publishing. And so I spent some time in publishing and decided it wasn't for me. And then, I'd always been torn between public policy and advocacy and literature. Those were just my two interests. And so once the publishing didn't work, I thought, okay, well, let's go back and try the other one. And I did a 1-year fellowship that was in a master's program in public policy and administration. And so I worked for the state of California doing some really interesting programs around children and families. And so it was an interesting position because I had a cohort of about 12 people who were accepted to this program, and I was the only one with a humanities background. I think there was one other person who was also an English major in college, but was very much kind of was going to pursue her JD. So I didn't quite fit in with this group, but it was really interesting to participate in conversations around public policy. And while I was doing this fellowship, I had the opportunity to write my first RFP, a request for proposals, a multi-million-dollar RFP. I wrote policy analyses for bills. I testified before the legislature on them. I got to do a lot of things that I'd always been interested in doing. And then once the fellowship was over, though, I decided to move on, and I spent more time in government. So working for the city of Oakland and the county of Alameda, again, around children and families issues, because I found those really compelling. And then at a certain point, even though the work I was doing felt really important, I was working with a community grants program and managing 35 different community grantees who were doing things about tobacco cessation or, arts for kids, things like that. I just wasn't having the kind of conversations I wanted to be having, and was doing all this reading in my free time and really decided it was just time to go back to school. I'd always thought about doing a PhD, but just wanted to have some other experiences first. And so I went back not intending to become a professor. I think I went to school with the idea that I wanted to see if I liked teaching, that I grew up in a family where my mother was a teacher, and so it was something I wanted to see if I liked. But I was always open to doing a lot of different things. And that actually, it was just for me, going to graduate school was a luxurious time of just reading intensely, being around others who were exploring these kinds of issues and asking the same kinds of questions that I was asking, just about a variety of texts. So it was just my time. Like, I just wanted that time to do that study. And I didn't actually think about what I was going to do afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I want to think about a couple things, and one of them is what were the conversations you wanted to be having that you mentioned? And then also, what did you discover about teaching? Did you end up liking it? Mm-hmm. Or how did it influence kind of your decisions during the degree, and then what you decided to do afterwards?
Mm-hmm. I wanted to have conversations I wanted to close read texts. Mm-hmm. I really wanted to go back and redo my undergraduate just at a different level. I wanted to close read texts with other people. I wanted to ask questions about why this is important. How does this help us understand, kind of larger questions about, how does art function? I mean, I was really interested in public art. So how does art function? Who is the public? How do we decide what is public art? I was interested in thinking about it in terms of, how do commissions in cities, create or fund this kind of public art? What goes into their decision making? And so I guess I wanted to spend some time thinking about the history of that. So, whether it was going to revolutionary France and thinking about the salons or, whatever, what have you, I wanted to spend some time doing that and kind of getting that background, doing the kind of comparative analysis that I always enjoyed doing, to then actually return. I guess if I had a plan, it was to return to government in a kind of arts commission capacity. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the conversations I wanted to have. I discovered I loved teaching. that it was one of my favorite parts of being a graduate student, and that it was mostly rewarding. I mean, there's always a class that, is just really challenging, but most of the time it was extremely rewarding. And that the teaching that I did helped me think about my research in different ways. And so, so I think, but, as I was nearing the end of graduate school, I was open to teaching, but I could never picture myself in an R1 university teaching. I just couldn't. I could maybe imagine myself teaching at a college like I went to school to do my undergrad. But I also, I had these moments where I would look at the situation and look at what kind of jobs are out there. And I just knew, that applying for these kinds of jobs required a commitment that I wasn't sure that I had for a variety of reasons at that last year of my doctoral program, for personal reasons as well as professional. And so I let go of teaching in that kind of official capacity. But it's still something, I still have the doctorate, I still have this teaching experience, and so I see, there are places I could go moving forward where I could kind of draw upon that teaching experience if I want to.
So how did teaching influence your research?
I taught a class on manifestos, and I had a lot of fun thinking, so I did all this work on Italian manifestos, right? And so one of the assignments that I did with my students is I had them create their own manifesto. And it was just a lot of fun. It was just a joyful experience to kind of go through and deconstruct a manifesto and see them be so creative around then reconstructing one according to their topic. But it helped me to think about, how manifestos are put together and the ways in which they're used and dispersed in a different way. And that was fun.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the research that you did for your dissertation?
Yeah, so it was a really big interdisciplinary project. What I think I will say about it is that it gave me, doing a dissertation gave me the time to really explore some texts that I'd wanted to explore. So for example, I worked on Virginia Woolf as an undergraduate, but had never had a long period of time to really immerse myself in the scholarship of Virginia Woolf and to spend some time looking. I looked at her last novel, Between the Acts. So my dissertation allowed me to do that. And there are parts of the dissertation I was more passionate about than others. I think one of the regrets I have, actually looking at the dissertation, that now graduate students perhaps have a bit more flexibility, is reimagining what the dissertation could look like. And I do think that it's really important, and I'm glad I did that, that big dissertation that I have on my bookshelf, right, that bounded dissertation, but I don't have any interest in turning that into a book. I think there are ideas in it that I would like to pursue in other ways. And so anyways, so the big regret that I have is that I spent some time looking at Calder and his circus, and he did a lot of work around children's toys and the mobiles. What would it have looked like to work on Calder in a way that wasn't a kind of traditional text format? What kind of digital humanities project, let's say, could I have worked on to actually give voice to my ideas that resulted in something that looked a lot different? And I don't know, this isn't a profound idea. People are doing this on a variety of topics, but that would have been a really interesting opportunity that I wish I had kind of been more aware of. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
you mentioned you're going to keep your dissertation kind of on the shelf, where moving on to...
I dust it every week.
Are you thinking about moving into another direction with your research? Are you doing research in your position at UCHRI? And if so, what does that research look like?
I want to revisit the dissertation because I think that in some ways I feel like the failure, right? The questions I was asking in my dissertation, there are follow-up questions to be asked. And it's not that I'm not interested in them. I am. I think that it's that I was always the kind of academic that, I just didn't need to have multiple books published. I think I'm just interested in exploring the idea and seeing where it takes me. And where it's taken me, this idea of publicness, is here, right? Thinking about doing programming for various publics around, some very traditional academic ideas and others not, right? So I think for me, I've just been collecting a lot of data around public humanities here, and it's been slow, and I didn't even know I was doing it. But as I was creating a relationship with California Humanities, Cal Humanities, we were starting to develop this idea of doing some kind of conversation around veterans and homecoming. we went to the Imagining America conference and presented on some of the work that was, just about to happen. And now that we've done this series of public conversations, I'm sitting here thinking about what worked with these public conversations, what didn't work, and collecting the data from that. I've also been in conversation with some of the PIs who have been heading up public humanities programs that were funded by UCHRI, and learning a lot about what they did, what they had to do, what it took to create very successful public humanities programs, what didn't work. So I have all this data and I want to do something with it, but I don't know what. And in some ways I'm challenged because I don't know exactly who I'm speaking to. On the one hand, I want to actually, because my job requires that the kind of research I do has a product that is useful, maybe not immediately, but certainly for my primary public, which are academics. So I want to think about how can UCHRI better support the creation of public humanities programs? And we're doing it, right? We're actually thinking about doing some kind of seed funding with the idea that obviously public humanities projects don't just happen, right? That it's years of relationship building. So we're thinking about that. But I'm also thinking about what would it look like if I authored a piece around public humanities. Some of the data is personal data that I kind of collected, right? And other bits of information are what I've gleaned from conversations with PIs. I don't know what this looks like. And in some ways I'm challenged by what form it takes. And I try to talk to myself and say, it's less about the form. What do I want to say? Maybe start there. So this is a project that I'm interested in pursuing. I think it's hard in a position like mine. There is a lot going on every day. And so having that time to do that kind of serious reflection and reading that's necessary to do this kind of scholarship, that balance is hard. And so that's a challenge of where I'm at. But it's something that I'm thinking about and that I definitely see myself pursuing down the road.
Well, and it definitely sounds like you're interested in questions of form, because you mentioned rethinking the dissertation in the first place. Right. So I think, it is really important to think about content, of course, but then also what form it takes. And I'm thinking in particular about Deo Goldberg's article in The Afterlife of the Humanities, and how it kind of takes this, I don't know what to call it. It's not a blog quite, but it's almost interactive. The photos scroll down in a very particularly aesthetically pleasing way.
It's dynamic. I mean, my husband, who is not an academic, read it and was, and my husband hasn't even read my dissertation, right? I mean, I don't blame him. But I think that kind of work can appeal to a variety of publics, and I dig that. And, certainly working at UCHRI, there's an openness to that. But exactly, right? So I mean, this, my kind of thinking about what public humanities looks like moving forward, and what it looks like in California, and what it looks like for the UC, I see it taking a couple of different forms.
And so have you drawn some inspiration from Deo Goldberg's work? And does he mentor you at all in your research at UCHRI? Is he an inspiration, or someone that you work with, that you collaborate on, that you ask questions with, that might lead you towards the work that you want to do as far as public humanities and thinking about what that might look like at these various different levels?
Yeah, it's a pleasure working for him because he's very open to experimental ideas, and that's nice. So not feeling, I don't often feel bounded here in any way. And that kind of openness to creativity really allows you to kind of pursue different ways of thinking about something. So David's been a good mentor, and he's also been, simply because of his experience, he's been a good mentor in terms of thinking about, the political situation of the university within this kind of larger public sphere, thinking creatively about how scholarship can look, thinking about building different kinds of relationships across the campuses. So it's been a good mentorship in terms of that. And in the past I've had other mentorships, but I think for where I want to go right now, this is a great place to be.
And did you seek out mentors beyond your advisor in graduate school? I feel like mentorship is something that can be really valuable, especially in thinking towards careers beyond the traditional R1 tenure track position. So was that something you were thinking about in graduate school? You also mentioned that you went back and worked for one of your former employers during the summer as a consultant. Do you keep in contact with those mentors or mentorships you developed there? How have you negotiated your relationships with mentors, both prior to graduate school, during graduate school, and then kind of moving out into your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the relationship with I think having mentors is really important, and I wish that I had done more of that. So with all of this work experience I had, when I worked for the state, I worked for some wonderful women who were in deputy director positions for the state and really powerful positions and who had been doing this for decades, right? And they served as mentors. But it's interesting, once I got into graduate school, it suddenly became all about coursework, right? It became all about the dissertation. And it's hard not to. It's really demanding. It feels like very different kind of work. And there's a way in which the disciplines of the people that I worked for in government, it was in public health, right? Or it was in education, but it felt distanced from higher education. Looking back on it, those were mentorships that I wish I had continued to build while I was in graduate school. And I would definitely do that differently. But they've been they're the best kind of mentors, right? They're okay that you drop in and drop out, right? So I've been able to drop back in and connect with them. And that's been really helpful for networking in terms of getting job interviews, right? My mentor helped me get a job interview for an education think tank in San Francisco. Didn't result in a job, right? It wasn't the right fit, but I was able to kind of make that connection. I think that, and I think that mentors can come in a variety of forms. I think that graduate student mentoring is another really wonderful thing that can happen too. So finding when you're, a new graduate student, finding an advanced graduate student who can mentor you through the process is invaluable. And I had that in various people. And then also kind of gave it when I taught the pedagogy class. So kind of that giving back. Yeah. So
have you found yourself in a mentorship position?
Well, I am right now, right? So having you here has been wonderful, right? To kind of think through these ideas. I mean, selfishly, it's been great because I've had a partner in crime to kind of think about how we want to do, various programs. But I think it's also really important to kind of think about the long trajectory, and being a mentor allows you to do that. So it's, as you're helping somebody, you're also thinking about, yourself and the arc and where it goes.
And so how did your research help sort of shape your thinking, your aspirations, and kind of where you've found yourself now in a career position?
I wasn't that, most of the time I'm so reflective. I wasn't that reflective. Actually, when I finished my degree, I actually, I had a baby, right? So I took some time off to just kind of do that. And then when I returned to the work world, I needed a job, right? That kind of, you need to pay the bills. I needed a job. I knew that I was going to wait for the right kind of job, right? And like fill in the in-between I did some SAT tutoring, some prep, but I was going to wait for the right job that had the kind of values that I wanted. It wasn't until I landed at UCHRI and was working on public humanities here that I had that moment where I thought, okay, I'm actually, the work that I did in graduate school is really applicable here. As I'm reviewing public humanities proposals or helping to write a call for proposals, working with faculty to better flesh out what it is that they want to do and how we can support them to do that I was drawing upon the scholarship that I had done in centuries worth of kind of reflections on the role of the public and art and those connections, the types of relationship between artists and the public. I think it wasn't until I was actually in the position that I understood how applicable my experience was. And I think it's because I was too close. I was too close to everything that I had done, and also in a mind frame of just needing a job, right. If that makes sense.
So could you talk a little bit more about how your advanced training in the humanities kind of influences the way that you approach your position at UCHRI and the work that you do? Like what motivates you as someone looking to engage the public, but also helping to facilitate academic scholarly research?
I think I'm sensitive to the way in which a lot of our work is comparative, right? So thinking about how to bring the work of, let's say, the religions and diaspora and global affairs to a variety of publics. And one of the models of public humanities is that we do this work in the academy and we kind of translate it for the public, right? And that's one way of involving a limited amount of public. But what does it look like when we actually involve the public in the creation of research, right? And so one of the exciting things about Radaga is that the structure of the studio is that we've invited journalists to be a part of this working team, right? So we've automatically, or from the beginning, I guess I should say, included a different public in the creation of this research. And so for me, I'm kind of drawing upon my scholarly research as I'm thinking about how we want to reach various people. And I'm also, this is something that I haven't fully fleshed out, but for me, I'm most interested in thinking about where public humanities goes down the road, how we can think about it in creative ways, and I'm not sure exactly where we're going, but I've been learning a lot here at UCHRI in terms of what public humanities projects look like, what it takes to create them, who they're engaged with, what's successful, what's not, and that's something that I want to pursue. And thinking about what does this look like? What does the relationship between the university and various publics look like moving forward? More and more, we're invited to engage in conversations about why the humanities matter and what we're here for. And I think this is a scary but exciting opportunity to begin to articulate different ways of engaging in research and then communicating that research in a collaborative fashion with others.
And would you like to talk a little bit about how that's being done for the Radaga project at UCHRI?
I could, yeah. So we're going into the last year of a 3-year grant around Radaga. And so each of the studios have very different projects, and I can speak about one of them. And these are all research projects that were created by the PIs who are involved, right? So my role is to really support the kind of work that they're doing. But one of the groups, they are studying religious festivals that happen, in public spaces across California, right? So this is really interesting to me. They're working on a documentary that's going to be shown in K through 12 classrooms about Day of the Dead. So those are some of the ways in which they're thinking about the kind of scholarly work that they're doing, the kind of ethnographic work that they're doing, the kind of artistic work that they're doing for a very specific public. And I think that's been the challenging aspect around public humanities is that I worry that when we say the public, people think mass public. And so there's been a lot of, I want to do more work around teasing out, who exactly are we speaking to? And being very specific about that as we go into these academic projects. Because speaking to, the public of millennials is going to be different than speaking to a K through 12 population. And so as we're creating these initiatives and as we're thinking about the projects that then go out into the world, though, I'm thinking about that and how best to do those and how best to support those.
Mm-hmm. So as someone who is supporting those kinds of initiatives and is working in an academic nonprofit organization, do you have any advice for current or future graduate students that are looking to pursue a similar career?
Yes. Yeah, it's hard. Let me just say that I'm conscious of the way in which the situation of graduate students is very challenging. And just getting your degree done, I found to be a full-time job, right? I think it was a little easier for me to transition from graduate student into this position because I was able to draw upon my experience in government. And so I had some kind of hands-on experience, writing briefs or doing newsletters, that kind of work. So I could point to those skills and also say, oh yeah, and I have this, intense training in kind of humanistic thought and asking questions and thinking comparatively, and all of that. So I think the more experience that you can have, the better. But I think you can be creative about how you do that. And you're doing it, right? Like you're spending your time this summer doing an internship program where you're conducting an interview, you're working on the development of a website, you're helping revise a white paper, right? But these are all things that you can point to in a portfolio and say, I've done this. Mm-hmm. And yet it's not disconnected entirely from the work that you do as a graduate student. My advice is to look for those opportunities so that it feels less onerous to kind of take on a separate job, and it feels more like a kind of rounded training, because I really feel like the training that we've done in graduate school and that you're doing is applicable beyond the university.
Absolutely.
And having friends who are, having a friend who's working for government right now, I think that there are lots of different institutions that would benefit from our training, and institutions that perhaps have similar kind of values or ethics or positions for making a difference for those that want to. I mean, I think people who want to be teachers want to make a difference, but there are lots of different ways to do that.
And so did you do anything over the summers or sort of as far as extracurricular activities when you were a graduate student that kind of helped you kind of draw on what you had learned in your experience working in government, but also kind of maybe help fuse that to an academic research kind of endeavor in the way that these two things have kind of come together and coalesce in your current position? Like, were there any opportunities that you sought out as a graduate student that, you know, drew upon your skills, but also helped you develop new ones that kind of helped you get where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the summer for me was the place to do that, because I don't know how you would do it during the year, right? Unless you had a GSR, which maybe I'll talk about in a minute, but. You know, I mean, I think that, of course, I taught during the summer, and so that was an opportunity to develop my own syllabus, and that was its own kind of way of creation, which I think is valuable for the work that I'm doing here, having done that kind of independent teaching, and the more independent teaching you can do, the better, even if you're not going to go into teaching. I would say that the skills that I did, you know, running my own course and thinking about outcomes are all, I hate to use this word, but transferable skills, right? But these are all different techniques for doing different kinds of work. One summer I returned to the county commission that I worked for before grad school, and I did some consulting work. And so helping them, I actually did some financial work for them, helping them go through budgets. I am not a budget person, but kind of, it was an opportunity, they trusted me, right? So I could return to them, and it was an opportunity to develop those budget skills, which have been helpful. But I also had a GSR through Dean Tyrus Miller to work on a white paper around, well, let me back up. I reached the point in my graduate career where I was finally vocalizing that I didn't know if I was going to pursue teaching. And so I was going to people asking for help, and I went to my advisor and talked to him about, you know, actually I didn't know how to, I had written resumes before, but I didn't know how to talk about, for example, my teaching experience, and I needed help with that. And so out of those conversations, which were fairly honest conversations, grew an opportunity to evaluate the current state of affairs at UC Santa Cruz around what kind of services were there for graduate students who wanted to pursue jobs that weren't teaching-based. And it was, of course, a comparative project where I was looking at the other UCs and nationally. And so that GSR was a really great opportunity for me to work on a white paper, right? Which I actually, my first year here at UCHRI, I was part of a working group that worked on a white paper. And it was also an opportunity for me to think deeply about the issues of alt-ac. And what I will say is that experience was very beneficial because after I interviewed here at UCHRI, they asked for writing samples, right? And I mean, happily sent them a chapter of my dissertation. But when they heard that I'd worked on the white paper, that's what they really wanted to see. They wanted to see, like, how did I think about these problems? What kind of solutions did I offer? And the kind of work that I did was, of course, informed by my training, right? And by, you know, my course of study. So that was very helpful.
And when you were in the process of voicing your decision to think about a career beyond teaching, did you feel like you faced any pushback from your advisor or from anyone in the department? Did you feel awkward about it? How did you kind of negotiate what can kind of be for graduate students a very scary conversation?
I waited until the very end, right? For strategic reasons. Not that I didn't think my advisor would support me, and actually he was very supportive, but conscious of the way in which there are implications for deciding to leave the academy, or at least there were. There wasn't much pushback, in my particular instance, but again, I waited until the end. And if anything, I received quite a bit of help from my advisor, including learning about this position at UCHRI. But I think it can be extremely scary, and I think that what worked for me might not work for somebody else.
That's great.
So, you know, to be honest.
That's great to hear, though. So you felt like as you were changing your CV into a resume that you received a lot of support for that, or did you feel like you were kind of negotiating that on your own based on your prior experience?
Absolutely. And I didn't do it that well.
Do you want to talk about that?
Right, because the kind of resumes I had written before, I was, early 20s and had undergrad training, right? And now I offered a very different kind of level of analysis and ability to kind of work on problems. And how do you represent that in a resume? I think for me, I really don't like the idea of translating a CV into a resume. They're very different documents. And so I tried to approach the resume as just a completely different thing. It's a different genre, right, in that way. And what it meant was being very selective about what I included and what I did not include. And so I did not include all the conferences that I, participated at, that I gave papers at. Maybe I included one or two. And I think that's really hard, which is that being very exacting and critical of, there are some experiences in graduate school that really kind of translate well, that represent well in the resume, and others that don't. But it doesn't mean it was wasteful. It doesn't mean that they weren't valuable, or that what I did in those instances of conferencing won't be valued in these other positions. But I think it was being selective. And for this job, I highlight, like, I had the luxury of already having a doctorate, and it's at UCHRI, right? They get what a doctorate is. I didn't have to prove that. And so in some ways it was very easy. They just knew what it meant. So all I needed to do was tease out the other kinds of work experience. But it would have been a very different process if I had been going into a nonprofit where my director didn't have a PhD. But my director has 2 PhDs. I don't need to explain. And I think that's, like, in terms of advice, and my husband and I agreed upon this when I was looking for jobs. We were going to, as long as we could, we were going to wait for the right kind of job. Though it was very tight. So.
And was there ever a point where you were exploring some different career paths where you felt like you were thinking about leaving the PhD off your resume, or any positions where you thought it might be considered a liability rather than an asset? I mean, obviously, at a humanities center, it's a great thing to have a PhD, and it's deeply informed your approaches to the work that you do at UCHRI. And I'm wondering, if this job hadn't come along, would you be kind of looking towards the nonprofit sector? How would you negotiate the PhD as you work with your resume, as you approach the interview process? How would you frame the PhD for a very non-academic position?
Yeah, those are really good questions. I'll speak on 2 levels, personally and then kind of advice. But personally, I was at the stage where I did not want to apply to a job that did not understand the value of a PhD. And I can imagine that if this job did not go through, I would have done that for about a year, if I had to guess, and then I would have reevaluated. But this is where it comes back to values, right? Like, I wanted to find a place that valued what a PhD, what it meant, what it signified, what it actually brings to. So no, and it would be extremely hard to leave the PhD off, right? I mean, you work so hard for that. That said, I have friends who apply for jobs and they have PhDs who leave it off because they worry they're not getting the call back because these organizations see them as overqualified. I think that I would have reached a point where I might have considered that. I think my advice is, we're doing a lot of we're going to be doing a lot of training around, thinking about how to create a resume. And those are some of the questions that we're going to be asking our resume expert, which is, how to communicate it in such a way so that it is seen as valuable and not as, potentially troublesome, right? I think I would use something like the cover letter as a place to really make the case for what the PhD brings, but in such a manner so that it isn't, it's not seen as that I want to come in and take over your organization because I'm I'm much more qualified than all of you. And I think that is also a kind of way of being in the world and a way of asking questions that some people are interested in doing and others aren't, if that makes sense. So, and I think it's a way of being humble too, that although I think the doctorate brings a lot, I don't think it's everything. And so, I would be conscious of the way in which I kind of engaged in that conversation.
And as we begin to wrap up, I'd just like to return to this question of values and ask you to maybe elaborate a little bit upon what you think is the value of having a humanities PhD and applying it in a position that's kind of outside the traditional tenure track R1 career.
The graduate students that I worked with were extremely creative and really serious thinkers. They were exacting. They wanted to get it right. They didn't shy away from asking the hard questions. They understood how what we're doing or thinking now relates to the past, relates to a variety of other cultures, how it operates in multiple languages. And those are the kind of people that I would like running my government. And they're not necessarily, right? Those are the kind of people that I would want to interact with more on a daily basis in a variety of different spheres. People who are thinking about how to do public programming for something like Cal Humanities. I could community-based organizations who are interacting with school children and creating programs. I mean, those are the kinds of people, I think that they just bring a lot. And so those are some of the values of the PhD.
You sound really passionate about those kinds of things. Are you thinking about pursuing them on your own in a different way? What do the next couple of years look like for you?
The next couple of years I will be here. We're just beginning a 3-year initiative funded by the Modern Language Association to think about ALTAC, which we need to come up with a much better name for. So I will be here, but I'm always drawn to government. I just think I'm skeptical of the way in which the culture differences, how that would work for somebody like me, but I'm very interested in it. And I'm also interested in thinking about community-based organizations and being more specific about the public that I'm trying to reach. And maybe changing that up, right? Right now, my primary public is an academic public, and I enjoy that. It draws upon what I did in graduate school, but what would it look like in 10 years if I was reaching out to a different public? I've always been interested in museums. Is there a place for somebody like me in a museum who's not doing curation, right? That's not my background, but who's maybe thinking about public programming, right? But just in a different way. I don't know. We'll see.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to answer my questions and provide us with a perspective of someone working in an academic nonprofit research-based organization like UCHRI.
Thank you so much.